harassment and discrimination in the workplace. Okay. Before that, though, we're going to have Matt Nelson and Matt Terry talk a little bit about our 401k and some different things and help you understand it and walk through that process. They'll be really quick. And then we have Jim McNall here with us from ICRIP, and he will be doing our training today. Once Jim gets finished up, any of you that are foremen, supervisors, if you even oversee volunteers, I need you to stay here. Everybody else is free to go, but I need you for just a few more minutes for the supervisory portion of that training. So we'll go ahead now and turn the time over to Matt.
All right, I'm just going to put a plug in for you guys' retirement and just encourage you to do a couple things. One of the things is if you haven't ever been on our employee portal and looked at the tab for retirement, we just encourage you to go there. There's just a handful of documents, probably 4 documents, 5 documents, and a few links that you can access the different options that you have in retirement. And then there's about a 1.5-page document that talks about a 3-legged stool approach that we encourage you to read, which basically just talks about your 3 legs for retirement, which is, of course, Percy is your largest. So it talks about that, and then it talks about the 401k options that we have through the city, and then it talks about Social Security. And then, of course, there's other options as well, which Matt Perry's going to talk a little bit about today, which is a Roth, which you can also contribute through the city now. And so the way that the Roth one works is that's from your net check, so it's after you pay taxes. And you just come talk to us, we do a deduction, and then we write a check twice a month, and send it to Edward Jones. But as far as setting up where that money goes, that's 100% up to you guys. You guys go meet with Matt over there, and you set up your account, whether it's a Roth or whether it's an individual IRA, whatever it is. As far as the 401k goes, it's really, there's an eligibility chart on there, but you really have to work for us for 6 months. You have to be over the age of 21. And that's basically about it. And then what happens is the city, if you put 4% in, that's 50%, so up to 2%. And so if you come and you're like, I only want to do like another 4%, we'll match 1%. And so what we really encourage you to take advantage of the match. It's, when you consider the tax part of it, it's almost like doubling your money right up front. So there's options of how you can invest that. It's totally up to you. And then, of course, you can talk to Edward Jones on recommendations they might have. So, Matt, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Passed out, each one of you should have one of these on the front. Basically, this talks about the Roth IRA and the advantages of it. It talks about different growth. If you had a taxable account and you invested that in, if you had your regular traditional IRA, which is just like the 401k, think of them the same way, and then a Roth IRA. The advantages of a Roth IRA is when you go to take that Roth IRA out, you don't pay any taxes on the earnings, the gains, or anything. So when you go to retire, you're going to have Social Security, you could have the Percy pension, right? Then you're going to have your 401k money. All that is taxed. When you take that out, it goes taxable income. What the Roth can do for you is you say, okay, you know what? I want to go buy a $25,000 car. I want to go buy a car when you retire. Well, if you say, okay, I'm going to go pull that out of my 401k, that's $25,000 added to your income. So if you're in a 20% tax bracket, it costs you $25,000. So you could say, okay, I want to take out my $25,000 car. I'll take $10,000 out of my 401k, and I can take $10,000 out of my Roth, and you don't pay any tax. You only pay taxes on half and half. Does that make sense? So to think about having some tax-free income would really come in handy for you on that aspect of it. I extremely encourage it, and I also, like Matt said, I would definitely take your match. If you're not in the 401k, that's 2%. Just leave it on the table. So at least do the 4 and get the 2. At least get the match on that one. The Roth, actually, if you're going to do a Roth, you need to let me know because they're going to send a check, and then I've got to get your Roth IRA account set up and show for that. Okay? Any questions on that? There's a little chart to look at. All right, the next chart This is how you log into your account. If you do not know how, there's step-by-step doing it. Now, I don't recommend, you know, if you look at it every day, you might go nuts. Because one day you're up, one day you're not good. So, but you should log into it and at least know where you're at. You can look at contributions. It's called myretirement.americanfunds.com. You can register. This kind of takes you to the sheet. This kind of walks you through it. If you have questions on it, let me know. I know Pam was real good at putting it on there too, but just call it. This should walk you through so you know how to log on to it. And I'll tell you one of the important reasons. If you look at the back page of that one, it'll show you what you can look at. This is kind of an example of it. It shows your balance and stuff like that onto there. So that way you can kind of look where you're at on that aspect of it. All right. The last page, I just kind of printed off the last page. You have to decide where you want to invest. And if you're not sure what to put it in, you have the option of these mutual funds. Okay. Let me just kind of walk through a few that you can kind of walk through so you say, well, what in the world I want to put it in. I can't go in and do it for you, but I can give you suggestions and then you can walk on the website and do it. If you have questions on it, we can definitely walk through it. So what I like to look at is you look at the year-to-date, see the year-to-date column? You look at the year-to-date column on here, it says the 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year. That's kind of what you want to look. You try to look at least the 5 and 10 year on them, and it kind of shows you how each one is done. The target funds, see where it says the first one, target 2010 means that you were going to retire in 2010, which is way past. So they'd be way conservative. But as you move down, you can do the target. So if you say, hey, I want to retire in 2035, you could do the 2035 target fund, and it'll automatically divide it up, and it'll put in, it'll make you more aggressive, and then when you get older, it'll downsize you into different investments. It'll automatically spread them out if you want. But if you look across the 2035, you can see the year-to-date is 6.3, 1 year 4.29, and the 10 years 12.17. Okay. So if you're not sure, if you don't want to individually pick them, you can pick the target date. What I tell people is if you're more aggressive and you think you're going to be 2035, then put 2040. If you're going to be less aggressive and you're still going to retire in 2035, maybe do 2030. Okay. All it means, and the rest of it means, is you're nothing totally risky, but you're putting more stuff into equities or stocks and less stuff into bonds, so you have more volatility. That kind of makes sense on that end. So you can adjust it on that end. And you can divide it up. 50% going to this fund, 25%, you don't have to put it all in one fund. So if you want it. Another one, a real popular one, if you look at the American Funds AM cap, okay, we'll just walk through that one. As you look at it, this is the balance. You can see how much, if you look at the balance, which I thought I wanted to show you, this is all the balance that all of you have in each one of the funds. It's not a bad idea sometimes to look at it and say, it looks like a lot of people in the city are into that fund. That probably means it's not a bad fund to be into. So I kind of show you the balance on there just to kind of give you an idea. Because that's what I do when I meet with mutual fund companies. I'll say, well, what is a lot of the Edward Jones people, what's the #1 fund that people are into? And then we try to put those funds an option for you guys. Okay? That way we make it. So if you look at the American cap on there, and it shows you, year to date, 1 year, the 3 year, 5 year, look what it's done the 10 years. So that's been a real popular one with you. Another real popular is the Income Fund of America. You can see all the volume of people that have money into that one. So if you're not sure, you can divide it. But you can put like 25% American cap, you can kind of divide it up to a mutual fund. Just a really quick lesson on mutual funds. Instead of owning Home Depot or Amazon or one stock in a mutual fund, you own hundreds of those stocks. And they're not, you don't own just one, you own lots of them. And you don't own more than 4 or 5% of your money into that one stock. And if the stock starts to fluctuate, the money manager just sells it, and you don't have to know about it. Because their job is to get you the best return. That's the advantage of mutual funds. You don't have to worry about your thing going to zero. Because those money managers, like if they think Amazon's going to pop, they're going to sell your stock. And even if it did, you only have 3% of your money in it. Does that make sense? So that's the advantage of the mutual fund. They're going to try to manage your money, and they each have different objectives on it. So you go in and you set yourself up and you put that aspect on it. If you're looking at your returns on and you're already in it and you're wondering what's kind of happening or whatever, you're welcome to call me. Numbers on there. I can actually go into your system. I can look at it and say, well, this is what you're in. we can talk about it if you like, and I can give you some ideas or suggestions on it. Don't hesitate to look at that. Most of the time, though, you just write it out. The idea is longevity, and just keep writing it out in that aspect of it. So I just encourage you to definitely get to be doing that and look at a Roth IRA for sure. Any questions I can answer? Yes.
Just one thing I noticed when I logged in is that the beneficiaries were zeroed out again.
Okay. The beneficiary forms actually stay with the city, and I think they keep them here. So it will show 0 when you log into it. But you should have, when you filled out this, they actually keep them. You actually keep them on file here.
Okay, so you'll have to fill out a beneficiary form to get on the line.
I don't think so. I don't think they do. I think American Funds requires them to keep it on file. That's why I understood it too. But make sure there's one filled out. If you're not sure, you can find out. And if you don't have benefits on file, get one.
And if you've had a change of beneficiary, make sure you get a new one.
Yeah, and if you're married, your wife has got to be your beneficiary, or she has to sign off that she will not be, which I haven't found one yet. So, but if you happen to divorce or change, then you need to get in and get that changed. Absolutely. Get that off of there. Make sure you look at your beneficiaries on that. Great question. Any other things I can answer? All right, thank you. Oh, I've decided that I wish I could give everyone $100,000, but I came up with $100,000 candy bar. I wish I had it, Not pass it down.
All right, now we're ready to learn about discrimination. That kind of fits together. There's lots of ways to lose money, and one of those is this way, so we don't want to do that. So, welcome to harassment class. I know you're all here only for that, and not because you got lunch or learned about finances, right? That's all that lunch. So, we're going to talk about primarily one type of harassment. So normally I do this as kind of an interactive process, but this is kind of a large group. But when I ask a question, you can respond. So the ones in the front are going to escape, but the ones in the back are the ones that need to answer any questions. So the protect, so you chose wisely. Well, you didn't choose wisely. You got in too late, so you had to be here. I understand that. So these are the protected classes. And if you look at either state or federal law, define where does it say that it's unlawful for me to harass my coworkers or others. It doesn't say that anywhere. What it says is it's unlawful to discriminate in employment, and harassment is a form of discrimination because it can affect someone's ability to do their job. And so not all harassment is unlawful, but it's all inappropriate. So even if it's not based on protected class, your policy prohibits harassment for other things as well. So harassment is unlawful if it's based on protected classes, which is age, race, religion, gender, disability, national origin, skin color. We tend to think of these protected categories as minorities, but the reality is that we all fit into several of these categories. We all have an age, but we're not all age protected. So what does it take to be age protected? And old as me is not the correct answer. I've been protected for a long time. Any guesses? Or knowledge? How about 40? Would you believe that? So every one of you is either age protected or hoping to become age protected would be my guess. Now there could be some exceptions. I've had a couple of young ladies in class that said, well, I'm 39 and have been for some time. I will never be age protected. Yeah, watch how quickly they turn 58 if something happens in the workplace. So we're not all age protected, but when it comes to, we all have a race, we all have a religion, or don't have a religion, either way that's protected. We all have a gender. We all have a national origin and skin color. We do not all have disabilities. So if there's one that we don't want to be, it's that. But most of us at some point will be. So we're going to talk about the one that is the most problematic for our members. And when I say our members, I'm talking about local units of government in Idaho. We now have, ICRIM now has about 960 members, almost all the cities, almost all the counties, almost all the school districts, as well as, about 600 other special purpose districts. So sewer and water districts, highway districts, all those are. So we only do local government, only in Idaho. So when we look at workplace harassment, we're going to be talking primarily about the unlawful type, but there's other types of harassment that could fit into workplace bullying, other sorts of things that again can affect someone's ability to do their job, but not necessarily based on protected class. So we never encourage harassment, but there's no law that says that you can't have a supervisor who's a real jerk and treats everybody poorly. If they treat everybody poorly, then that's probably not discriminatory. If they just treat some people based on protected class, then that is unlawful discrimination. And I'm not suggesting for those of you that are supervisors to just treat everybody poorly. That's not a good idea. But targeted employees, whether it's unlawful or not, feel threatened, unable to do that. And so, just because someone's a bully doesn't mean that that's unlawful harassment. We're going to talk primarily about sexual harassment. I've had some in class say, well, that's the most fun. That's not the correct answer. The reason is because when we look at the allegations of harassment that our members, local units of government in Idaho deal with, probably more than 90% are based on gender, so sexual harassment. So that's what we're going to talk about. So the Supreme Court, and this is the U.S. Supreme Court, quite a number of years ago, provided some guidance for employers and said in order to protect employees from being harassed and employers from liability, all employers need to do three things. Have a policy. So does the city have a policy on harassment? That would be one of those. And I'm sure you all dusted it off and read it last night in preparation for today's class, right? Yeah, that would be a lot. Well, not necessarily. I had a young lady in class one time that said, yeah, I read it. I initially kind of thought she was kind of spoofing, but then I discovered that the day before had been her first day on the job and she'd been assigned to read the policy, and she had. So that does happen, but very, very rare. So the city has a policy, provide training on that policy, which is why you received engraved invitations to be here today. Those engraved invitations are spelled mandatory, right? I've heard that word. I've heard that term several times already. And so not everyone understands what that means. Several years ago, I did a class in the far corner of the state, in one of those counties, or Knight County, and it was a mandatory class. And one of the law enforcement officers ended up taking a better option of going hunting. So about 2 weeks later, I was doing a class up in the Wood River Valley, I think it was at Haley, and he showed up there with kind of a sheepish grin on his face, and he said, the sheriff said I would come to this one because that's what mandatory means. So, again, so be here. Now, my understanding is that you're kind of making it easier because it's being videoed so that those that miss it can do it that way. But, plus, is it really a penalty to have to drive up to Sun Valley? Probably not. Anyway. So, provide training, which is why you're here. And the third thing is a workable remedy. And no one can guarantee that every situation can be resolved successfully, but it means that the city needs to have a process such that when harassment is reported, it can be looked into and hopefully dealt with. The good news about harassment, if you could say those terms together, is that when properly reported before it gets to be a big deal, harassment is usually easy to cure. Almost always, the harasser thinks they're being cute and funny. And all it takes is to let them know that it's unwelcome and behavior stops in most cases. Now, there are among us some slow learners where it takes more than that, but most of the time, that's so the city has that process in place. So, your policy, the most important part of that is how do you report harassment? Have a procedure for investigation. Investigation sounds, we call it an investigation, but that sounds like kind of a big deal. And the reality is sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just a matter of talking to the individuals involved and maybe witnesses to find out what happens. So it needn't be a long, drawn-out process. And then prohibits retaliation for those who either report harassment or are accused of harassing or are a witness that is talked to. So the most important part of that is who you report to. So under your policy, you have options. So you can report to your supervisor, your department head, which may or may not be your direct supervisor, HR, the mayor. And so what's different about that than any other thing else that you encounter in the workplace is that it includes people within your department and outside of your department. This is, I haven't read all of your policies, but I'd be willing to bet this is the only place in your policy that is a specific exception to the normal chain of command. Normally, if you have an issue in the workplace, you go to your supervisor. Unless there's a problem, then you go to their supervisor. The courts have said over and over again, that does not work. And so that's why your policy includes options to report. And it isn't like you have to go to your supervisor first. You can go to any of the above, and that's really important. So, the goal of that is to make it as easy as possible to report harassment. It is never easy, but the goal is to make it as easy as possible. So, if you feel that you have been harassed, you should report it. If you see coworkers being harassed, and because of the definition of harassment, you may not know that your coworkers are being harassed, but you see inappropriate behavior. In fact, when we look at the investigations or the reports following someone talking to people following an allegation of harassment, almost always, I would say always, but that's not a good idea, almost always, the remaining coworkers, often including supervisors, say, yeah, I saw that behavior, I knew they shouldn't be doing that, but I didn't realize the impact it was having, so therefore I didn't know that it was really affecting someone's ability to do their job. And so almost always someone else is aware of it. So if you see that behavior, stop it. Let somebody know. In a perfect world, you could go to your coworker who maybe just made an inappropriate comment or an off-color joke or made a compliment that wasn't whatever that was, and say to them, you know, that comment you just made or that joke you just told really is kind of inappropriate. It seemed to make this person really uncomfortable. You probably ought to not do that. That's a pretty powerful message if we're willing to do that. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So what is the definition of sexual harassment? And you could replace sexual with age, religion, gender. Well, this is gender. Age, religion, any of those other protected classes. So, sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature when it is a term or condition of employment, used as a basis for employment decisions, or creates an offensive working environment. We seldom see, and hopefully we won't see, the first one. Because by definition, that's fairly blatant. And by definition also, it includes someone in a supervisory role, someone who has the power to make or at least influence employment decisions. That's the type of behavior that we've read about and heard about on the news over the last several months. People in power using their power for something of a sexual nature. That doesn't happen much in our world of local government. We hope it never does. But by definition, it involves supervisors. The second one is kind of the same thing. We don't see that very much. Only it may be to a lesser degree. While the first one may be something blatant. You know, if you want this job, you better be willing to go on dates with me. Or the second would be, you know, I may be a department head and I've got an opportunity for a promotion for one of the persons in my department, and there are two that are about equally qualified. One of whom laughs at my off-color jokes and one who doesn't, so I promote the one who does. That would be an example of that. Again, probably doesn't happen a lot. When it does, it's really difficult to find out about. Which leaves us with behind door number 3, the offensive work environment. That, by far, is the most common. Probably 95% of all allegations of harassment fit into that category. And so, we'll talk about what could constitute an offensive working environment. So when you look at that definition, there are 3 elements necessary to have sexual harassment. something of a sexual nature. Usually not too difficult to determine, though I can tell you that reasonable people disagree about what is sexual in nature. Second is conduct in or related to the workplace. Usually we're talking about behavior that occurs at work, on the job, between coworkers. But it doesn't have to be that, but it has to be connected to work in some way. My guess is that many of you, Friday night, well, the season is about over, but oftentimes Friday night you may spend it at a high school football game or basketball game or something, and you see coworkers unrelated to work. So hopefully none of you says anything stupid, but if you do, that probably doesn't constitute harassment. But when you have other events that are work-related, most years, and I haven't looked at statistics this year, but most years there's kind of a spike in allegations of harassment right around the first of the year. So what could cause that? I hear some answers, but not loud enough that I can hear them. So,
Company parties.
Company parties, yeah. The good news is your city party is not this kind. But in many private companies around the country and around the state, if you work for that company, you're expected to show up at the party, get drunk on your lips, and oh, by the way, behave. I can tell you that's not a good recipe. And I generally assume that our members, public agencies, don't have that kind of party. I had some sheepish looks when I made that of one of our members up north, and they probably had. They didn't have that kind of party, but it was closer to that. I'm guessing we do. So that would be an example of not at work, but related to work. It also doesn't have to be coworkers. It could be contractors, vendors, others that you work with in some way. And in many situations, even the citizens who come in and interact with you on a regular basis may do that. In fact, that's one of the things that the EEOC is focusing on is employees in whatever type of field that are being subjected to inappropriate behavior from those that are customers. That's a real challenge in what you do because you're expected to provide good service. Sometimes that good service can be taken by those who receive it as, oh, I was treated really nicely, he must like me, or she must like me. That's not the case, but that happens. But still normally not too difficult to deal with when the conduct is inappropriate. The third one is the one that really makes it difficult, and that is the actions are unwelcome. This is a moving target. What's welcome to one person wouldn't be welcome to another. And to make it even worse, what's welcome to one person today may not be welcome tomorrow because of a variety of other things. So this is the real tough part. Again, almost never does the harasser think that their behavior is unwelcome. You look at some really inappropriate behaviors that we've seen this morning that, and I don't follow singers, so I don't know that, but they, as I was getting ready this morning in the hotel room, I had the news on, and they were talking. There was an interview with R. Kelly, who I never heard of until just recently. But in his mind, and I believe he probably thinks he's telling the truth, he's never did anything that was non-consensual. Yeah, illegal, yes, but, and he probably actually believes it. You think that makes it okay? No, it doesn't matter what he thinks, it's what the other person thinks of that. So, certainly, I don't expect anything from any of our members that's that blatant, but sometimes behavior comes. So, some examples of things that could constitute harassment. Joe likes to tell inappropriate jokes, and Bob asks him to lighten up. When the supervisor is there, nothing happens. Is that harassment? We're talking about sexual jokes, so the answer is yes. We know it is because it's at work, it's in the workplace. It's sexual in nature, and it's unwelcome, and we know that because Bob said so. So, it is harassment. What's the supervisor's role? Because it wasn't really a complaint to the supervisor. The role of every supervisor should be to never get a complaint of harassment. And the way to do that is to stop the behavior before you get the complaint. The supervisor ought to step in, go talk to Joe and say, knock it off, that's not okay. And I'm going to be paying attention to your behavior, and I expect that to change. Supervisors really are the key to changing this sort of behavior that could constitute harassment. A female employee participates in, sometimes an initiator of sexual banter, innuendos, inappropriate jokes. And then when she's given a notice of termination, all of a sudden she's a victim of sexual harassment. You think that's valid harassment? That was a question. You can shake your head. As irritating as it is, yes, because it was unwelcome, even though it may not have been at the time. And that's what I talk about, the unwelcome as a moving target. Now, is there going to be an argument that, yeah, you participated in it? Absolutely, but it doesn't absolve the, it doesn't absolve the employer from an allegation of harassment. I can tell you this is not that uncommon. Even before you get to termination, just a notice of discipline, and all of a sudden, what was fun yesterday isn't today, and I'm going to go complain about it. That happens. That happens more than we would like. An employee downloads sexually explicit materials from the internet, sends it to their friends in other offices or the same office during work time, or no, not during work time, but to their friends. Could that be sexual harassment? The answer is yes. If you're going to harass your coworkers, this is our preferred method. It makes the investigation so simple, even I could do it. We're going to talk a little bit later about, a little bit more about the dangers of communication in our electronic world, or even otherwise. But this happens a lot. And it's not what you receive in your computer that is a problem. It's when you push send. And send is a dangerous button, or reply. But reply all is really the stupidest one. One of our members from farther north in the state had, a few years ago, most of them are gone. It's amazing how elections weed out problems sometimes. But there were a number of elected officials and some department heads that got into the habit of sharing information, not pornographic, it wasn't unlawful or anything, but it was just inappropriate sexual content, a variety of things, jokes, photos, those sorts of things. And I had been up and done a class for them, and so for somehow, and I don't know how this happened, but I got in that list of people that when they clicked reply all, it came to me. And so I looked at that for a while. Finally, I went to the county, it was the county, and I said, you know, number one, you should stop doing this. And if you don't, at least take my name off the list. That's highly stupid. So don't do that. So, but we see a lot of otherwise really good employees losing their careers and their jobs because of doing stupid stuff electronically. Don't be one of those. Be careful what you send. And once you send it, it's kind of like it's too late. I don't know whether you've noticed, but you can't unplug your computer fast enough to stop once you push send. Unless you have programmed your computer so when you push send on an email to give it a delay. Any of you have that? I've had that, and it's really helpful because I often push send when I shouldn't. It's not because I'm sending inappropriate material, it's because from one of our members asked me for something and I'm sending them a sample policy, and I type the email and here's what you need to do, and then immediately when I push send, I notice that I haven't attached the attachment. So if I have a little bit of a delay, I can catch that, and that's good. But it also helps with inappropriate material. Two coworkers having an affair, telling sexual jokes, touching and pinching each other. Could that be sexual harassment? Well, it's welcome, so how could it be?
Different day.
It's what?
It could be a different day.
It could be a different day, yes. So what's the likelihood their relationship will stay the same as it is? It would be 0. Now, their relationship, this could be the 1 in a million and they get married and live happily ever after. And by the way, if they do, the behavior will change. So that will no longer be a problem. And I say that kind of jokingly, but not really. We have many of our members, and I'm guessing there are husband and wife who work for the city. It would be rare if the city decided to do. And generally their behavior is okay. And if it isn't, you get called on. But yeah, so their relationship is going to change. And most of the time, when it ends, it won't end with both of them going happily on their way. So one or the other or both will be unhappy, and so they're likely to file. Who else should say this, that they're being harassed?
An observer?
Yeah, the observer. The coworkers who observe this behavior may be offended by it, or they may not be offended by it and still say they are. So why would someone report being harassed by this if they weren't really offended by it?
Jealousy.
Jealousy is one of them. Well, if they're jealous, they're probably offended by it, yeah. And we've actually had that happen. We had a gentleman who filed a claim and said, I'm terribly offended by this. And the reason was because he'd been doing the same thing with the same young lady 2 weeks earlier. So that's jealousy. But also, what are they not doing?
Working.
Their job, yeah. So, eventually coworkers get tired of picking up the slack and they're going to do it. So coworkers could file a complaint. One of them, who else?
Public.
The public can look at this. Now, technically, it's not, the public is probably not being technically harassed under the law, but yeah, what's the public going to say? This is a waste of taxpayer money. You must have too many employees there if you've got time for this. So it's a little different, but it's still a valid complaint from the public. I heard someone else say another answer to spouses. We have discovered there are some spouses so narrow-minded they frown on this behavior. And our experience is that when this type of behavior is occurring, there are almost always spouses. So if two single coworkers develop a relationship, they can go on dates, they can do things outside of work, and they're less likely to be engaged in this kind of behavior at work. The worst example that I have seen of this was where this kind of behavior was occurring in a workplace. Both participants were married, and all four of them, meaning both of them and both their spouses, worked in the same department. When that blew up, it blew up in a manner that none of them ended up working there because of their behavior. So, relationships develop in the workplace. Relationships can be a problem in the workplace because it makes it difficult sometimes. But it's not the relationship that's the real problem here. It's the behavior at work, and that's what really needs to be focused. If a coworker doesn't intend their jokes and pats be taken in a sexual way, then of course that couldn't be sexual harassment. Would that be true? I mean, that's obvious. It doesn't matter. But it's here because that's almost always the case. I've never seen anyone, well, with one exception, but it's a little different. I've never seen anyone who says, you know, I'm going to go to work today and I'm going to harass my coworker just because I think I should. The one exception was a supervisor, actually an elected official supervisor, who discovered after hiring a person that they probably had hired the wrong person. So she talked to me and said, you know, I really shouldn't have hired her, so I'll just make her life miserable so she will leave. It wasn't sexual harassment, it was just harassment. I said, no, you won't. That is really stupid. Don't ever do that. So that's the only time I've ever seen anybody intentionally harass. But yeah, we don't intend to. And sometimes in today's world, it's real easy to have things taken out of context. Were any of you offended by or bothered by something that I just said? Last week, I made the comment about spouses not approving of this kind of behavior. And it was pointed out to me that that's not true of all spouses. Well, I hadn't really thought about that because, you know, my spouse would particularly consider that. But, so it's real easy to be taken out of context. If a supervisor selects a female employee over a male employee to dress up the front office, is that sexual harassment? So what is it if someone says, I will only hire a man or only hire a woman for this job? It's a pure form of discrimination. Are there cases and positions where we can say, I will only hire a man or only hire a woman for this job? An example would be, let me help you with that. The best example is down the road a block or so. In the jail. Yeah, we insure all but one jail in the state. We strongly encourage them to have both male and female detention officers. So that would be an example. And it's never because only a man or a woman can physically or mentally or otherwise do the job. It's to meet the needs of the clientele, in this case either male or female inmates. So this would be a pure form of discrimination. Yeah. To dress up the front office, if that's your reason, you're probably on the edge of you're one of those that's likely to be a harasser, but not. So, one of the things that's in your policy, and everyone needs to understand, and I don't say this to encourage you, to discourage you from reporting harassment, but there's a thing that happens to us, and that is when we have something that's bothering us, and we share with someone else, sometimes we feel better about it. So it's not uncommon for someone to go talk to the supervisor or to HR and say, I'm being made really uncomfortable by my coworkers when they're doing jokes, comments, whatever it is. But I don't want you to do anything about it. You just need to understand that your supervisor or HR or the mayor have an obligation, once it's reported, to look into it. Doesn't mean there's going to be a big deal about it, but they have an obligation to do that. And the fact that you say, I don't want you to do anything, they can't honor that request. And so everyone needs to understand. So, another example, supervisor overhears sexual comments made to another coworker. There's no complaint. Should the supervisor wait until they get a complaint? The answer is no. Again, this goes to that earlier discussion about almost always when there's a complaint of harassment, the supervisor could have stopped it before because they saw the behavior and didn't take action. So the goal of every supervisor, again, is to stop the behavior before they get a complaint. Because once they receive a complaint, it's kind of out of their hands. Then it needs to go through the process of reporting to HR and the mayor so that others can look into it. Even if Tony doesn't seem uncomfortable, if you see the inappropriate behavior, that's a place to stop it, because you're not going to see everything. So when you do see something, stop that behavior. So what types of conduct could be involved in harassing that are physical in nature? So this is your opportunity. So what could be physical in nature? This could constitute harassment. That was that question thing that makes it uncomfortable for all of us, so I need some answers.
Giving a hug.
Giving a hug. Is a hug the worst thing? The answer is no. It depends. It depends on the situation and under what situation. So here's some types of touching that in the past maybe that are not okay. And I had some folks in class the other day who described it as the good game, Pat. The good game. Yeah, that's no longer acceptable. So it's not the worst. It's a continuum from a good game, Pat, up to and including sexual assault. And we don't think of that, which is criminal behavior, but we don't think of that often as being sexual harassment. But it meets that definition. Are there some types of touching that are generally okay in the workplace? Handshake, generally okay. Things go well, fist bumps, high fives, generally okay. Coming up, behind someone who's seated at a desk and touching their shoulder to get their attention, generally okay. Holding your hand there and massaging for 15 minutes while you talk to them, never okay. And even a handshake. Even a handshake has a comfortable time, and then it gets pretty slimy pretty quick if it goes just a little too long. And I've never measured. I had someone in class last week, and I said, well, and she said, well, I know. She said, it's 2 Mississippis. Beyond that is too long. I'm not sure that that's accurate, but anyway. So now at least I have an answer. And so there's those types of touching that are generally okay. And here's what I mean by general. You may have coworkers who are uncomfortable being touched even in those ways. And if they express it, then that's pretty much an FC standard. Basically, that makes them uncomfortable. It's also important to recognize that I'm talking about casual touching between coworkers, not work-related touching. Many of you work in jobs where you may be involved in instances where you're interacting in really uncomfortable ways with your coworkers. Would that be, someone who's putting up a fuss where there's 2 or 3 officers involved, or firefighters, responding and trying to get people out or help each other, or just in a daily work setting where you bump into each other all the time. That's not what we're talking about. That's work-related touching. So we're talking about casual touching between coworkers. So, a few types of touching: handshake, high fives, fist bumps, that are generally okay. A whole lot that's not okay, from all the grabbing, pinching, all that kind of stuff. And then there's some types of touching that I would describe as in between, which would be your answer, which is what? Hug. Yes. I think your current practice of starting every day with a big group hug in each department is probably over the top. You do that? Probably not. But one of the things that tends to be true about public employees is public employees tend to stay at their jobs a long while. And if you work with someone for 10 years or 20 or 30 or 40, a couple things happen. One is you develop a relationship with them. And maybe a relationship such that a hug would be comfortable. Maybe a relationship such that a hug is not okay. And the other thing that happens is things will happen in their life or your life where maybe a hug is okay. A birth of a child or a grandchild, kind of a happy occasion, or a death of a family member, where depending on but it always depends upon the 3 things. It depends upon the relationship between those individuals, and it depends upon the situation, again, normally happy or sad occasion. And it also depends on the culture in which you work. And I don't mean the culture in the city, but the culture of those that you work with closely. And that varies, The culture, when it comes to those kinds of things in City Hall here, is going to be different than any of the emergency services, which is going to be different than Public Works. I'm generally kind of, pick on Public Works because I generally say to them, probably in your culture there's not a lot of hugging, and I've so far never had anybody disagree with that. Not to be presumptuous, but probably not. So, anything you feel compelled to share in the physical? Okay, what about nonverbal? What are some nonverbal things? It could be an element of harassment. I would put emails, text messages, those sorts of things. And again, this is not to be age discriminatory, but I'm picking on people that are below 40, so it's lawful. One of the challenges we have in today's workforce is a lot of younger workers are used to living their lives electronically and sharing way too much information. We've had more than one workplace where we had coworkers who were sharing nude photos of each other with other coworkers, and surprised that that was a problem when they got called. To me, that's sort of a duh, don't do that. But that is not common sense. It's part of why we need training for it. So for those of you that are doing that, stop it. You'll end up losing your job. Pin-ups, posters, calendars, the sorts of things we used to see in the workplace that we don't see anymore, right? And the reality is we don't see that very much. And when we do see them, they're different. When I first started with iCrimp, I'd go around and I'd go to various and sundry, primarily male-oriented workplaces, city shops, other things. And it was common to see calendars and pin-ups and posters. I don't see that anymore. In fact, in the last few years, I've seen more of those sorts of artwork in female workplaces than male workplaces. But neither are okay. And then there's all the assorted gestures, eyebrow raising, flicking, all that kind of stuff that fits into the category of leering and oogling, all those sorts of things that are not okay. So anything I left out that you feel compelled to share? Didn't think so. Okay. Probably the biggest area of concern is verbal. This is what's most easy to misunderstand. if someone sends you an email, you've got time to look at it. But by the way, if someone sends you an email, there's only one thing that's always true of any electronic communication. It will always be looked at in the worst possible light. I know I've received emails that just, I thought, that was really rude. And then I re-looked at the words and they weren't at all. But we tend to take them in the worst possible way. So be careful about your electronic communication. Verbal is kind of the same thing, only not quite so good. So inappropriate sexual, racial, religious jokes, not okay. Comments that aren't. There are some folks that think they're really clever. So they'll say nice words in a not nice way. So to say to a coworker, "You look nice today," is probably a compliment. Right after your coworker has been at the water fountain, you say, "Ooh, you look really nice today." The same word is not a compliment at all. We have people who will try to play on that, so don't do that. Names. This comes up almost all the names that coworkers don't appreciate being called. Things like sweetie, honey. If you want to be called those names, where can you go?
The diner.
Home. Thank you for thinking home. But yeah, the diner. So what's the message? The message is, you and I are tight, we're buds. I just don't know your name. You know, because I travel the whole state, they know my name at the diners. I've been there too much. That's probably not true of you because you go to the same place frequently. But so that's the message that's being sent. The problem with that is when you refer your coworkers by those names, it kind of sends the same message as, I just don't remember your name. And that's probably not true, but that's the message that we receive. I remember several years ago, I had doing a series of classes for one of our members, and I probably had a dozen different employees come up to me afterwards and said, "We have this supervisor who calls us these names and it drives us crazy." And she doesn't have a clue. So I did something that I normally wouldn't do. Normally if I have employees talk to me about what they perceive to be a problem, I just share that with the appropriate person, or with the appropriate supervisor, department head, HR. In this case, this was someone that I'd worked with quite a bit. So, something we want to share? So I went to her office afterwards and then knocked on the door. And so what do you think she said? "Hi, sweetie, come on in," which was a good lead-in to our discussion. And she described herself as incurably Southern, like it's a disease. It can be, even being Southern, or any of you from the South. Okay, any of you from the South that don't want to, that would admit it. Okay. There are probably some from the South. But you can recover from that. And you need to be careful about that. That's not appropriate. And then there's the worst, some of the other worst things that we don't necessarily think about as being harassment, but just everyday gossip. We're gossiping about our own or our coworker's sex life is not an appropriate workplace activity. And that happens too often. And sometimes, you know, we're talking about someone and thinking they don't know. Well, that's probably not true. They probably do know. It's probably making them really uncomfortable, which meets the definition. So, some things to talk about that are unique to harassment. First is intent versus impact. We expect in our lives to be judged based on our intent. Intent is, were the actions I took reasonable given what I know or should have known? That's intent. In harassment, it makes no difference what I knew, thought I knew, should have known, if it's based on gender, religion, race, disability, any of those protected classes, and in the workplace. The only other thing that matters is what does the other person think of what I said or did. Most of us initially, that sounds like, well, that's not very fair. That someone else gets to determine, to judge my actions based on how it makes them feel. But if you think about it, nothing else would work. If harassment was determined based on my intent, then I could never harass anybody because I would never intend to. And I could get away with really inappropriate behavior. And frankly, over the years, many of us have gotten away with really inappropriate behavior. And that needs to change. So it's always, harassment is always determined by the receiver of the behavior. So costs, two types of costs. First is dollar costs. Harassment claims can be fairly costly. The good news is we don't have a lot of it, but we spend, you know, probably a minimum $50,000 to $500,000 probably every year in harassment claims. Most of that goes to attorneys. But when it gets to that point to where there's a claim or any issues that get to either to the media or to the courts, then there's a much larger cost, and that's the impact it has on people's lives. We deal with a lot of really serious issues that happen around the state with public agencies every day. We probably received 3 claims since I started talking an hour ago. Probably all 3 of them are related to vehicles. But probably a couple times a week, we'll get serious claims regarding personnel issues, and it's not uncommon. And some of those, part of those issues are related to harassment and/or discrimination. But in harassment especially, the impact on people's lives is much greater than the dollar cost. 3 things happen frequently to the victim, or to the harasser. Well, same thing to the victim, but to the harasser. And again, this is where there's not just an allegation, but an allegation that when the investigators look into it, and this happens time and again, harassment is almost always underreported. And so oftentimes the investigator and talking to others and to the 2 involved will find out that the behavior was far more inappropriate than was reported. And so in those cases, we frequently see the harasser, or the accused harasser, losing their job. The reality is I have seldom seen harassers who were terminated from their employment. What we see time and again is when that issue arises, they know what's going to come out of the investigation, and they resign. I dealt with a claim, this was a number of years ago when I was up north, where within 8 hours of the initial claim being filed alleging harassment, the person who was accused of harassing had resigned from their job, left their community, and their family had not gone with them. That's rare that it happens that fast, but we see that over and over again. I mean, this is a conversation at home that none of us would want to have. Go home and say, hey, guess what, honey? Funny thing happened to work today. Fill in the blank. Accused me because your spouse knows your coworkers. Accused me of harassing her or him today. Now, you know I would never do anything like that, but you'd probably also be interested to know that I resigned from my job. That's not a very family-friendly conversation. So none of us would want to do that. So frequently the victim has kind of the same sorts of things. So the victim is not going to be terminated because there's a little thing called retaliation. And so once you accuse someone of harassing, you're kind of actually in job protection for a little bit, because if you get fired, it's going to look like that was retaliation for that before. But frequently, not always, but frequently, and again, this is where harassment gets out, isn't handled like it should be in the workplace, but gets outside of that. Frequently, the same three things happen to the victim. They're not going to be fired, but we see time and again the victim leaving their employment within a matter of a few weeks to a few months at the most. And the reason is almost always, and this shouldn't happen, but it does, almost always the remaining coworkers choose up sides. They blame one side or the other. And there aren't sides. You know, in the case I talked about where the person left within 8 hours, that behavior had been going on for a long time. It was banter back and forth, and it just got out of hand where it got too far, and one of the persons got uncomfortable with that. And so that's often what happens. But in that case, what happened, and this is normal, the remaining coworkers chose up sides because some of them blamed her or their friend who had left employment. And so the victim often loses their job, impacts their career, and their family sometimes doesn't look kindly. So my point in all that is that the real cost is the impact it has on people's lives. And it isn't just the people directly involved, it's their their friends and their coworkers. We have one of our members down the road here, well, a couple of miles, or farther, that had a high-profile harassment allegation probably about 5 or 6 years ago now. And they have not yet, because of that dividing up, you know, you're on one side or the other, that department has not yet fully recovered from that. That's everybody who was directly involved has been gone for over 5 years. It has serious impacts on lots of people. So, things you can do. I'm going to suggest 3 things. The first one seems really stupid, and that is don't be a harasser. Well, that seems like of course we don't want you to be a harasser. But there's an easy part and a hard part. The easy part is if I'm someone who tells rude jokes, sends inappropriate emails or text messages or other electronic communication to my coworkers, makes inappropriate comment, gossips about my coworkers' sex lives, or brags about my own on Monday morning, whatever that would be. Any of that is inappropriate. I could leave here today and say, you know what? I really like my job, and that could affect my ability to have a job. I'm not just simple decision. Stop it. That's all it takes. One simple decision. That's me. The hard part is I'm not so naive as to believe that there won't be sexual comments and discussions that happen in the workplace. It's all around us. And to be, what makes it so seem unfair is that the standards between what's acceptable in the workplace and what's acceptable in society have always been different. But what seems to be acceptable when we watch TV and other media is the standards have just dropped out of the bottom. So there's never been as big a difference between what's acceptable at work and what's acceptable outside. So those discussions, to a certain extent, will happen. So the hard part is, when involved in those discussions, I need to be paying attention to how my words and my actions are impacting my coworkers. And that requires ongoing attention. And for most of us, that's not what we're used to doing. You know, if I'm telling a joke, I'm focusing on not messing up the punchline more than how is this being received by my coworkers. So paying attention is the hard part. So don't be a harasser. The hard part and the easy part. If after eating that potato bar, you only wake up for one sentence today, this is it. And that is, don't be a victim. That seems to be silly because, of course, no one wants to be a victim. But because harassment is always determined by impact, in many cases, even though other coworkers saw the behavior and said, I knew they shouldn't be doing that, usually the only person who knows that harassment is occurring is the victim because it's about how they feel. And so the victim has a power then of knowing that harassment is occurring that no one else has. And so they have multiple good choices and then some bad choices. So a good choice would be to go to the person whose behavior makes you uncomfortable and say, you know, that makes me uncomfortable. By the way, saying that makes me uncomfortable is a really powerful message. So if you go to them and say that, yeah, that makes me uncomfortable, please don't do that or don't say that, that's a pretty powerful message. But harassment, by definition, is not about gender or race or religion or anything else. Harassment is always about power. It's the power to make someone uncomfortable. And so because of that, it's unrealistic in many cases to expect that the person who's uncomfortable will talk to the person whose behavior makes them uncomfortable. And so that's why your policy is important. Go to someone else, let them know. Because the goal is to change the behavior. The goal isn't to get rid of that person, ruin their life. The goal is to change the behavior so that everyone's comfortable in the workplace. And so properly reporting harassment can help that to happen. So don't be a victim, let someone know. There are other ways in which harassment is solved that are not acceptable. They haven't and they should. But we still see, even in today's world with training and policies and HR people who can provide assistance, we still see too many times when someone is harassed, they solve it by leaving the place. And that's not an acceptable cause. Your valued employees. I've worked, in the time I've been in Thycamp, I've worked with 3 coworkers who have shared with me that they left previous employment because of being harassed. 2 of them from the state of Idaho. That's not an acceptable cost, so please don't. Work within the system. And most of the time, it can be resolved successfully. So, don't be a harasser. Don't be a victim. And the last thing I'm going to suggest is watch out for each other. As I said earlier, almost always coworkers, when asked, say, yeah, I saw that behavior, I saw that interaction, I knew that shouldn't be happening, but they don't understand the impact it's having. So when you see your coworkers engaged in behavior that could constitute harassment, help them out by letting them know. It's always difficult for someone who's the receiver of behavior that makes them uncomfortable to report it. But if I'm a coworker and I see that happening, and it's much easier for me to report it, or to go to the person whose behavior seems to be offensive and say to them, you know, knock it off, don't do that, or to report it to a supervisor. It's always easier for a third person to report it than you. So watch out for each other. And there's only one reason you would report it, or that you would talk to the current person whose behavior was offensive, and that is to protect them. Because if this continues, then they're likely to be in trouble. So don't be a harasser, don't be a victim, watch out for each other. Finally, one of the things that is my goal for you is to help keep you off the front page of the paper. Almost always, if you make the front page, it's not a good thing. Now, we want you to do wonderful things, and you do. But if you do the most wonderful thing, or save a kitty, where's that reported? Page 3, page 4. Almost never on the front page. So your goal is to stay out of the news with the word harassment or retaliation or discrimination attached to that. And because all of us in the room are public officials, it makes reporters more likely to want to write about us. And so there's a difference being a public official. It does make a difference when it comes. So think about the type of behavior that we've seen on the news recently. Most of that way over the top, much of it criminal. The impact it's had on people's lives. Not just people who have lost their careers and their jobs and their reputation, but their victims also have had their lives changed. So certainly dollar cost. Some large employers have paid millions to try to cover up harassment, only to fail. Now you've got 2 problems. You have the harassment, and you have the attempt that you paid millions to cover it up. Harassment is not good. Covering it up is always going to be worse. And then think about the reputation. Public agencies rely on the reputation to be able to do the most effective work. It makes a lot of difference what the reputation is. So, questions, comments, or threats about harassment? Okay, hopefully not threats. So I want to talk a little bit about communication and some things that you may not have thought about. And I refer to this as inadvertent public records. And the reason is because we've had some public records created that the person didn't think about. So, let's start with the definitions in the Idaho statute, the public records statute. So, public record is any writing for the conduct or administration of the public business. That means that pretty much anything you touch or create during your job is public record. But it's only a writing. And then 3 paragraphs later, writing is defined as everything. Pretty much the only way you can have information that doesn't constitute a public record that's about your job is what's between your ears. If you're unfortunate enough to get involved in litigation, there's a process to suck that out. We call that a deposition. But that's beyond a public record. So, that's a very broad definition. Then the Idaho Supreme Court, several years ago, in a little case out of Kootenai County, expanded that even beyond that. So there was a request for public records involving potential harassment. A few emails between an elected official and one of the employees in his office. About 597, but whose county? And the county denied that public records request, saying, well, it's not a public record because it doesn't deal with the conduct or administration of the public's business. Supreme Court in that case 5-zip said, no, it is a public record and it will be turned over to the newspaper. Just to share how bad they were, the newspaper didn't know what to do with them when they finally got them. I mean, there was a little article, but they didn't really show much. So, the Supreme Court said the fact that those communications could create liability for the county makes them a public record. That has implications for you. What it means is the stupider your communications, the more likely they are to be a public record. And it could be a variety of things. It may be, we're seeing, posts on social media and other things that public employees are losing their positions because that affects their ability to do the job. It can create liability for the city. So this is kind of an important thing. So what kinds of things do we see that could constitute harassment? Discriminatory comments, jokes about protected groups, sexual disclosures or innuendos, again, gossip. Verbal gossip is bad. Written gossip is worse. Again, because it proves. Photoshop, it's funny to take your boss's picture and put it on some body. It's on a beach somewhere. It doesn't look near as funny when it's on the front page of the paper with your name attached to it. So think about what would this look like in the public. So my computer did it. None of you would do this. But a ways south of here, we actually had, this is what we refer to as things that former employees have done. Because former employees seem appropriate word. But anyway, there was a gentleman who worked in a public agency who just liked a couple of his coworkers and was told, well, he made some inappropriate comments and was told by the supervisor, you can't say those things, stop it, knock it off. And so he did. But he typed in his thoughts into his computer, and then when his coworkers walked by, he would just move the cursor, which would cause the computer to read back to him what he just typed. And it was not very complimentary. And so when the boss came, he said, what is this? I told you not to do that. He said, oh, nothing, it's my computer. If you blame your bad actions on your computer, you need to find another, you should start filling out your applications because you would and could and should be fired. And then we talked earlier about think before you push send. When you push send. Some other things that are a challenge. Some of the things that we have seen that are public records that persons didn't think about. And once you have a public record, then it needs to be handled like a public record. And so, if you're at a work-related scene and you have photos, photos are good. I'm not saying don't take photos. We love photos. When something happens, the difference between a slight fender bender and oh, you wrecked my life forever with my bad back is often photos. I mean, we love those in terms of handling claims. But when you take a photo, if you're on the job, you just created a public document that needs to be part of that file. Emails sent to personal addresses. This can be a challenge too. You may receive information related to your work. This is the biggest problem with elected officials, more so than others, but it can be a challenge for anybody. Text messages regarding, from the public works supervisor, it looks like it's going to start snowing, in the middle of the night, rather than starting at 7, we're going to start at 4 tomorrow morning. That's a work-related document that needs to be captured somewhere because it can be really important if something happens later on. So we all need some training and some policies about our electronic communication. There's a presumption that anything that's on a electronic device owned by the city is available to the city. I'm sure your policy states. The reality is it doesn't make a lot of difference in terms of when it comes to public records, whether it's on a public device or a private device. What matters is what is it about? Is it about the conduct of the public's business? So one of the things that we recommend is that you keep your public and private lives separate. Part of the challenge is that what is a public record is generally pretty well misunderstood. If I were to ask your citizens, many of them would say, well, public record is something the city has that I get to see. And they are half right. It's something the city has, but not necessarily something they get to see. So I made up a little test, and then this will be the end of the presentation. So, for each of these types of records, there are two questions. Is it a public record? And then secondly, is it available to the public under public records? So recordings of board meetings, whether that be P&Z, council, other advisory boards, if you record those, is that a public record? Is it available to the public? Almost all. Reference books. So if you have some hardbound books somewhere, is that public record? Probably not. And if someone requests it, because it's not specific, it may be something you use in your job, but it's not specific to your job, unless it's a book you created. Is it available to the public? Someone comes in and says, I'd like a copy of every page of that book. By the way, in my past life, we had that happen. So none of these are hypothetical, they've all happened. No, she didn't get it because it's a copyrighted book, so it's not necessary. Names and home addresses of employees and elected officials, public record?
No.
Yes. Yeah, remember, it's all you. Does the city have it, and is it used for public business? Yes. Is it available to the public? No. Actually, that's a trick question, because the answer is yes and no. Names are available. Home addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers, health information, all that other kind of stuff. The statute, there's about 20 pages of fine print of records that need not be disclosed. There's a few that says shall not be disclosed, and your personal information is one of those that says shall not be released. Wages and salaries of public officials, all of us. Yes and yes. The gross salary, not the net. Information in your personnel file, public records. Yes. Available to public? Generally not. So when can a personnel file be released? Or do what? Subpoena? Yeah, litigation. Or with your written permission. So why would you get written permission? Generally because you applied for a job and part of the application is I hereby release my personnel file to you. It's not to the general public. Records of calls, texts, tweets on your personal phone related to work. The answer is yes. They may be public record, and they may or may not be available to the public depending on what they are. We tend to think of emails and text messages as a type of record. They're not. They're a method of delivering a record. So I may be a supervisor and I have an employee who just messes up again. So I text my department head and said, Joe just wrecked the truck again. Well, that's a personnel record. So it's public but not available to the public record. So, questions, comments? If not, thank you for putting up with me for this long. I think I squandered more time than I was allotted. And for supervisors, please stay around for a few minutes. The rest of you can go do some work. Thank you.